Kill her! Kill her! Such was the counsel of Judea's King Herod to Marcus Antonius regarding Cleopatra, as confessed by the king to Caesar Divi Filius. And Herod had nearly done her in himself several years earlier, when the Queen of Egypt had visited Jerusalem. Marcus Antonius had marched for Media Atropatene near the end of 36 BC. After parting with Antonius in Syria, Cleopatra had journeyed to the court of King Herod. There, absent Antonius, Cleopatra had wantonly attempted to seduce the Judean king, prompting Herod to consider having her murdered. But Herod's advisers persuaded him that Marcus Antonius, who was wrapped around her little finger, would never forgive him, and it would suddenly be King Herod facing execution. But now that Cleopatra of Egypt had been proclaimed an enemy of Rome, the tables had turned, and it was only by returning to his country with the severed head of his lover in his hands, and throwing himself at the feet of Caesar Divi Filius, now widely acknowledged as the master of Rome, that Marcus Antonius might hope to stave off his own execution. During the winter months of the 31 to 30 BC year, following the Battle of Actium, Caesar oversaw the settling of approximately 10 of his veteran legions, whose military service had included Gaul under the command of Julius Caesar. Appointing Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa and Gaius Maecenas to keep a watchful eye on the government in Rome, Caesar allowed these veterans to return to Italy, along with the members of the Senate whom he had forced to march to war with him. He then spent the cold months on the island of Samos, planning his invasion of Alexandria. During that time, Caesar received word from his cousin, Lucius Pinarius, whom Marcus Antonius had put in charge of Cyrene. After learning of Antonius and Cleopatra's disgraceful flight from the Battle of Actium, Pinarius had formally defected to the side of his cousin Caesar, offering him the use of the 4 legions under his command. In response, Caesar sent one of his legates, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, to Cyrene to take command of those legions, with instructions to prepare them for a coordinated march towards Alexandria. However, before Caesar departed Samos to commence his part of the coordinated march, he received word from Agrippa in Rome. The treasury was empty. There was no money to pay the newly retired veterans, much less to provide land on which they might settle. 10 legions of veterans were now angry and had mutinied. Italy was in turmoil. Caesar notified Agrippa he was on his way. By the time Caesar landed at Brundisium, the whole of the Roman Senate, save a few praetors and tribunes of the plebs, had weathered the 300-mile journey from Rome to greet him. The senators stood alongside masses of cheering crowds as Italy welcomed the victor of the Battle of Actium. There in Brundisium, Caesar negotiated with the mutinous legions, dangling promises of gold and land contingent upon the fall of Alexandria and his success in laying his hands on the treasures of Egypt. By personally advancing the legions what pay he could, Caesar was able to secure an agreement with them. With his legions now motivated to await his victory against Cleopatra, he returned to Samos. With the nearly 23 new legions he had acquired from Marcus Antonius following the Battle of Actium, now integrated into his own forces, Caesar began making his way through Anatolia. There, he set in motion a process meant to prevent Cleopatra's allies from resupplying her with fresh legions. It was somewhere in Anatolia that Caesar was hailed by King Herod. Judea's king had begun the journey to Anatolia in early 30 BC, desiring to herald the victor of the Battle of Actium. There, before Rome's new master, Herod humbly surrendered the crown which had been procured for him by the power and agency of Marcus Antonius, to whom Herod had remained loyal throughout. It was, then, Herod's reasonable expectation that Caesar would now transfer the rule of Judea to another, and his desperate hope that he might keep his life in the transaction. But we are told that Caesar was so impressed by Herod's speech, and by his loyalty to Marcus Antonius, that rather than remove him from power, Caesar reaffirmed Herod's position as Rome's client king of Judea. During his lengthy progression through Anatolia, Caesar had also maintained the reigns of kings Polemon of Pontus, Amyntas of Galatia, and Archelaus of Cappadocia, all client kingdoms arranged by the Eastern Triumvir, and an indirect acknowledgement by Caesar that Marcus Antonius had been a good judge of character insofar as choosing administrators who upheld the interests of Rome. In the town of Ptolemais, within the kingdom of Phoenicia, Caesar was able to reap an immediate benefit by retaining King Herod as an ally. Along with beefing up Caesar's forces with additional legions from Judea, King Herod was invaluable in resupplying Caesar's men before they continued southward towards Egypt. Pelusium, at the easternmost edge of the Nile Delta, stood in the way of the only land route into Egypt from the east and had to be dealt with before Caesar could continue on towards Alexandria. Indications are that Caesar's forces occupied the city so quickly that it was assumed by many that Cleopatra had ordered Pelusium's governor, Seleucus, to stand down and allow Caesar passage into Egypt, signifying a willingness to save herself. After all, she had been sending letters, messengers, and extravagant gifts to Caesar as inducements to negotiate with her, and to allow her children to inherit Egypt, to be governed on Caesar's behalf. Perhaps Egypt's queen now viewed Antonius as a liability. Marcus Antonius had certainly considered that possibility. Caesar had sent a freedman named Thyrsos to Alexandria. His stated mission was to accomplish just such a shift in the queen's view, and to persuade Cleopatra to betray Antonius. After some time, Thyrsos returned to Caesar, having been stripped and brutally flogged by Marcus Antonius himself, when the general grew suspicious of the frequent number of private meetings between Cleopatra and the freedman, suggesting Antonius may have wondered about the queen's willingness to save herself at his expense. However, we are also told that Cleopatra was outraged that Seleucus had lost Pelusium so quickly. Accusing her governor of defecting to the side of Caesar, Cleopatra took his wife and children, already hostages in her court, and turned them over to Marcus Antonius for immediate execution. Whether or not Antonius executed the man's wife and children is not known. Prior to this flogging of Caesar's freedman, Marcus Antonius had also written letters to Caesar requesting he be allowed to simply retire from public life. But because he had only recently bragged that he needed no offices with which to unofficially rule the East from Alexandria, he knew remaining in Egypt would be out of the question. Antonius instead offered to remove himself to Athens, where he vowed to retire from politics altogether. However, after returning Caesar's freedman with strips of flesh torn from his back, all bets were off. It was around this same time that Antonius decided he might yet win back the loyalty of his legions in Cyrene, those who had been withheld from him by Lucius Pinarius. Gathering a force, Antonius marched on Peritonion, where the legions were now stationed under Cornelius Gallus. But Antonius failed to retake his legions and was forced to retreat back to the capital. When Caesar reached Alexandria, he made camp near the suburb of Canopus, outside the city's enormous hippodrome, where an advance guard was surprised by the forces of Antonius, who enjoyed a victory. That same night, though strangely, one of Antonius's legionaries defected to Caesar's camp, offended that the Egyptian queen had thought it appropriate to act as a general, awarding him a golden breastplate and helmet, rather than the standard falere, torques, armbands, and other military awards which should have been presented by Antonius himself. The following day Caesar received a challenge from Marcus Antonius, inviting him to a single combat conclusion for supremacy. Caesar responded to Antonius' challenge, writing that such a thing was unnecessary as, quote, "There are many different ways for Marcus Antonius to die." On the 31st day of Julius, Antonius feasted with his men in preparation for the final battle against Caesar, which was set for the next day. It is said that Antonius ate and drank well, expressing to his weeping officers that he did not expect to survive the following day. During the night, around midnight, a cacophony of music, shouting, and singing awakened the men of both armies. The sound was described as being akin to a troop of revelers singing and dancing in the streets. Unable to locate the source of the sounds permeating the air, many came to the conclusion that it was the supernatural sound of Dionysus, the Greek counterpart of the Egyptian god Osiris, with whom Marcus Antonius had identified, exiting Alexandria in advance of the city's downfall. On the 1st of Sextilis, the naval forces and the cavalry belonging to Marcus Antonius surrendered ceremoniously, sans battle, to Caesar Divi Filius. Those of Antonius's infantry who did not immediately run away were quickly subdued by Caesar's forces. Marcus Antonius is alleged to have made his way back through the city walls, where he then fell into a rage. Believing the queen had secretly arranged the mass defection of his legions in secret negotiations with Caesar, Marcus Antonius screamed at the sky, loudly accusing Cleopatra of betraying him to the very men against whom he fought for her sake. Terrified of what Antonius might do to her, and mindful of her own chances for survival, Cleopatra hurriedly sent word to Antonius that she had committed suicide. It was after this that Antonius fell on his own sword, but failed to die. Lying on the ground in the greatest of agony, Antonius pleaded with those around him to complete the gruesome task, but they simply ran away. Eventually, Marcus Antonius was transported back to Cleopatra, where she and her attendants hoisted him via ropes up and through an open window to breathe his last in her presence. Caesar, leading his men on foot, entered Alexandria through the Sun Gate, accompanied by a well-known Alexandrian philosopher named Arius. Crowds gathered cautiously as Caesar, Arius, and the Roman legions marched up the Canopic Way. Caesar then went into the gymnasium where Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra had once staged the now notorious donations of Alexandria. The gymnasium, large enough to host the whole of Alexandria's population, was a packed theatre as Caesar approached the speaker's platform. The crowd, terrified that the conquering general would now unleash his legions on the city to pillage, plunder, and rape, prostrated themselves. But Caesar gave no such order to his legions. Instead, he announced to the Alexandrians that he would not hold the city accountable for the conduct of Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius. Then, at the urging of the philosopher Arius, and as a demonstration of his goodwill, Caesar pardoned a number of important Alexandrian citizens. Caesar then proceeded toward the royal quarter and palace, but discovered it to be nearly empty. Cleopatra, in addition to spiriting away her son, had evacuated her royal court, sending its imperial residents fleeing towards the city of Berenike Troglodytis in Upper Egypt. She then closed herself and her handmaidens into her partially constructed mausoleum and sealed the doors. Inside her tomb, Cleopatra had stockpiled her royal treasures of gold, silver, pearls, cinnamon, ivory, emeralds, and ebony, along with a large quantity of firewood and tinder, the necessary elements of self-immolation should she hear any commotion outside her burial chamber. Should the Romans attempt to break in, she was fully prepared to fulfill the promise to Caesar, setting fire to herself and to all her sought-after treasures. Gaius Proculus, the very man whom the dying Marcus Antonius had singled out as the only associate of Caesar's worthy of Cleopatra's trust, as she entered into negotiations with Caesar, noticed that the window through which Marcus Antonius had been dragged was still open. Discreetly placing a ladder against the wall, Proculus climbed up and through the window while guards engaged one another in conversation, hoping to distract Cleopatra, who obliged them as she strained to listen through the doors of her tomb. Descending on the surprised queen, Proculus quickly restrained her, preventing her from lighting any fires as Caesar's men began battering at her doors. Once inside her mausoleum, Caesar's men seized Cleopatra and her handmaids, taking them into custody, while leaving the dead body of Marcus Antonius to be removed by the soldiers. When the bloodied sword that Antonius had used to kill himself was given to Caesar, we are told that he broke down and wept, just as he had done upon learning of the death of Julius Caesar some 14 years earlier. For some days following the capture of Cleopatra and her handmaidens, Caesar did not see her, choosing instead to attend to the immediate business of stabilizing his conquest. And the first order of business for Caesar was cancelling the donations of Alexandria, whereby Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra had given possession of many eastern kingdoms to their children. He also set about removing and punishing those who threatened his newly acquired success. for desertion of his post at Actium, to which he had been assigned by Marcus Antonius. General Publius Cornelius Crassus was executed. Although short on details, Caesar also executed the son of his former fellow triumvir, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus Pontifex Maximus. The younger Marcus Lepidus, who was once betrothed to the eldest daughter of Marcus Antonius, was discovered to have been involved in a plot to murder Caesar Divi Filius for having forced his father out of the triumvirate, with Antonius and Cleopatra as possible accomplices. Lepidus's mother, Junia Secunda, who was sister to the late Marcus Junius Brutus, was also summoned to the east and commanded to stand before Caesar to answer charges of her involvement. However, the young Lepidus's father negotiated bail, allowing his mother to remain in Rome until Caesar returned. When his widow learned of his execution in the east, she is said to have swallowed burning coals from a brazier, thus ending her own life. Although Ptolemy Caesar and Marcus Antonius Antyllus were nowhere to be found after having been formally recognized as adult men in a citywide ceremony held within the Hippodrome, Caesar captured the remainder of the children residing in Cleopatra's court. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, along with the hostage children of Cleopatra's allies and governors, were taken into custody and prepared for transportation back to Rome. When Cleopatra mysteriously fell ill, Caesar finally visited her. Having abandoned her glamorous image, Caesar found Cleopatra lying on a mat in a simple tunic, her eyes sunken, hair unkempt, and with an expression of wild abandonment on her face. At the sight of Caesar, Cleopatra jumped up and threw herself at his feet, pleading with him to understand her position as a queen who had been the political pawn in Marcus Antonius's great bid for power. Claiming to have been afraid for her life at the hands of Antonius, Cleopatra asserted that she had been forced to participate in the war against Caesar. As Caesar debunked each one of her explanations, exposing them as desperate excuses, Cleopatra chose to simply beg for mercy, petitioning Caesar to spare her life. We are told that Caesar was pleased by her desire to save herself, as he hoped to make her the main exhibit of victory before the citizens of Rome in his triumphal parade. However, Cleopatra, left alive, presented a particular complication for Caesar, for he had been in Rome when his adoptive father, the dictator Julius Caesar, had marched Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, in his triumphal parade. With his own eyes, he had witnessed the sympathy of the people for Arsinoe, how they had demanded that Julius Caesar take pity on her, allowing her to live out her young life in exile. Also problematic was the fact that Caesar Divi Filius had spent the better part of the previous 2 years engineering an image of Cleopatra which personified Eastern deviousness and double-dealing, making of the Queen of Egypt a monster in the eyes of the Roman people. But were the people to see this frail, weak, and pathetic woman dragged through the streets of Rome, he might only arouse compassion for her and cause the people to question his crafty narrative. How could this pitiable creature have duped their beloved Marcus Antonius? As much as Caesar would have delighted to parade Cleopatra in chains before the Roman people, her absence had its advantages. Several days later, a young officer on Caesar's staff let it slip to Cleopatra that she and her children were to be transported to Rome in 3 days' time. This young officer was Publius Cornelius Dolabella. Cleopatra had, in times past, provided legions to his father in support of military action against Brutus and Cassius. Now, based on the information casually given to her by the younger Dolabella, Cleopatra made the decision that she would not be marched in a Roman triumph. On Sextilis XII, according to Plutarch, Caesar Divi Filius received a note from Cleopatra, replete with Egyptian prayers and a personal request that her body be interred next to the body of Marcus Antonius. Caesar immediately sent messengers to find out just what was going on. Bursting through the doors, the messengers found Cleopatra lying dead in full state. Displayed on a bed of gold, a body, which was freshly bathed and scented, was dressed in royal garments and arrayed with ornaments. On the floor at Cleopatra's feet, her handmaid, Iris, lay dying. Her other handmaid, Charmian, just about ready to fall, barely able to hold up her head, stood and adjusted the diadem on Cleopatra's forehead. "Was this well done of your lady?" demanded one of Caesar's messengers. The dying Charmian answered, "Extremely well, as became the descendants of so many kings." Charmian then fell down and died. Upon immediate examination of Cleopatra's body, 2 pinpricks were discovered, leading to the assumption that she had died by the bite of an asp or Egyptian cobra. However, Plutarch tells us her death was quickly done, and that the messengers arrived with all haste, where they found no snakes in her chambers, and even when fatally bitten by an asp, it would be several hours before the victim would expire. Yet, we are told that Caesar immediately ordered snake charmers to suck the wound and withdraw the venom in an attempt to revive Cleopatra, but to no avail. Before long, the story circulated that Cleopatra had committed suicide by snake bite, a uniquely pharaonic narrative considering the role the asp played within Egyptian religion. Whether Cleopatra died by snake bite, self-administered poison, or was secretly murdered is a question that remains unanswered. But her death was certainly advantageous to Caesar Divi Filius, who then endeared himself to the Alexandrian people by allowing both Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius to be embalmed and royally interred with the appropriate honors due them, as well as by providing public funerals for Iris and Charmian. He also grew his popularity with the Alexandrians by playing the awe-struck tourist, admiring the beautiful city of Alexandria, its detailed architecture, and the city's vast and glorious history. When visiting the tomb of Alexander the Great, the philosopher Arius, who had become Caesar's constant tour companion, asked if he would also like to see the tombs of the Ptolemies. Caesar responded that he came to see a king, not a row of corpses. Approximately 11 days after Cleopatra's death, we are told that her son Ptolemy Caesar fell into Caesar's hands. Ptolemy had been convinced by his tutor Rhodon that Caesar had forgiven him, as he had forgiven all the Alexandrians, and that he would not be punished for his mother's misconduct. However, the Alexandrian philosopher Arius counseled Divi Filius that too many Caesars is not a good thing. Caesar took the advice to heart, as Ptolemy Caesar, the 16-year-old son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was then executed by order of Caesar Divi Filius. On that same day, Marcus Antonius Antyllus was found hiding within a temple alongside his tutor. The young man was spotted clinging to a statue of Julius Caesar. Despite his screams for help, Caesar's soldiers dragged the 17-year-old from the temple and cut off his head. And so, on Sextilis 23rd, both Ptolemy Caesar and Marcus Antonius Antyllus, recently proclaimed adult men before the whole of Alexandria, ceased to be a threat to Caesar Divi Filius. With Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra now dead, and most of his enemies defeated or subjugated, the kingdom of Egypt was formally annexed by Caesar, thus ending the 5-decades-long struggle which had existed between Egypt and Rome, launched when Egypt's King Ptolemy X Alexander had bequeathed his kingdom to the Romans in his last will and testament. By the year 29 BC, Caesar Divi Filius was formally recognized in Egypt as the first Roman pharaoh, under the Egyptian name Ptah Kaisaros. This concludes the story of Antony and Cleopatra. Please join us for Series 10, where we will examine the constitutional settlements by which Caesar discreetly gathered even more power for himself, forever changing the face of the Roman Empire. Thank you for watching.